Hello, hello! Welcome back to Loki's Librarian. If you are new here, welcome. I am your librarian, Katrina. On Sundays, I do a thing called Books and Booze, where I review a book and mix up a cocktail. This month, we're looking at the Indian side of history of the Wild West, making this week's book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, An Indian History of the American West by D. Brown. The accompanying cocktail is a broken oath, because there is no cocktail called Broken Treaty, but a broken oath is damn near the same thing, historically speaking. So AI actually spit back a couple of options for a broken oath cocktail. I went with the vodka option because I already had all of the ingredients. Thought I'd save myself a little money this week. It is 1.5 ounces of vodka, 3/4 ounce of Amontillado Sherry, 3/4 ounce of Sweet Vermouth, 1/2 ounce of Coffee Liqueur, and 2 dashes of chocolate bitters. So let's do this. So Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee is at its heart a story of conquest, the conquest of the American West, as told by the survivors of that conquest, and not the surviving conquerors, the conquerees, the ones who are conquered and live to tell the tale. This would be, I imagine, like if finding scrolls from Samarkand written by survivors after the sack by Genghis Khan, excuse me. How is that? How so, right? But different. Well, first off, we don't have any survivors. We have the wreckage that was, built upon by the people who came in after the fact. So different, because Genghis Khan never saw himself as a good guy. And when he decided a city needed to go, he literally destroyed every man, woman, and child within the city, pulling down the walls behind him and salting the earth with the blood of the dead. That was just his style. That is just how he did things. Sure did. Sweet Vermouth, Amontillado Sherry. How is it different? Well, Genghis Khan never saw himself as the good guy. And while no one with even the slightest knowledge of American history would argue that the destruction of the tribes wasn't awful, it truly was. America did see herself as the good guys, which means, from a historical perspective at least, she made one very grave error, in that she left survivors to tell their side of the story, which was then compiled into this book by D. Brown. Oh, I have to eyeball this. I have to eyeball this and the Amontillado, because guess what? I don't have a 3/4 ounce mark. And it's not easy reading, all right? It's billed, if you look it up on Amazon, it's going to tell you it's billed for ages 12 to 18, because they want to get them young, hit them early with that white guilt before they have a chance to gain any other perspective, which, okay, if you're... That's certainly one way to capture the educational system. There's a lot going on there that we could address. I think it is important reading, but I don't necessarily agree that it is for ages 12 to 18. And not just because the subject matter is awful, it truly is, but because it's not easy to read. It's not necessarily written with the 12 to 18-year-old in mind. It's not like Sweet Valley High, where they're trying to just, or even Harry Potter, where they're just trying to get kids to read anything. This is the sort of book where if you get them to read it, they're going to hate reading. Kind of like The Great Gatsby, right? Might be the point. Get them to hate reading so they don't bother to ever learn anything else. They're not going to read this and go, look what I learned. They're going to read this and go, well, first off, that was awful. Why the hell would you make me read that? Because it's horribly tragedy. It's demoralizing to realize that your ancestors were not the heroes that you want to believe. Oh, shit. Well, I'm going to say the alcohol is preserved, at least I hope so, because I don't remember the last time I used Kahlua. It was not easy reading. It's not comfortable reading. It's not designed to be comfortable reading, even from the comparatively safe distance of 150 years after the events contained herein, 150 to 126, because the book basically ends in 1890. It should not be. It's not meant to be, and it should not be. How the tribes were treated is genuinely appalling, especially after the events herein occurred, right? It's not like the abuses on the reservation stopped at 1890 with Wounded Knee. They did not. They continued well into the 20th century. We're talking go up into the 1970s, when they were forcibly sterilizing women on the reservation. They'd come in for a doctor's visit and come away unable to bear children. That's true fact. You can look that up. That actually happened. I'll see if I could find the law that made it so and throw it up here if I remember to do it, because it's appalling. So how the tribes were treated is genuinely appalling, especially as when the events were fresh, as they were happening, Americans still saw themselves as the good guys in this tale of tragedy on the western frontier. Americans saw themselves as a civilizing force, bringing peace and Jesus to the savages across the American West, uniting the nation under a manifest destiny, which was President James K. Polk's vision for her. And it could be argued that this is exactly what happened, right? It did unite the United States, but only if you assume the tribes were not civilized to begin with. When I say 1/2 ounce of this, 1/2 ounce of Kahlua. And then 2 dashes of chocolate bitters, and then I gotta stir it out. So if you assume the tribes were not civilized, then yeah, they Americans absolutely brought civilization, at the point of a gun, but they brought civilization. Jesus. 2 dashes. I gotta stir this up. So let's talk about that. Were the tribes civilized? Depends on your perspective, right? From the perspective of even most modern Americans, let alone those who fought in the Indian Wars, absolutely not. Even today, a frightening number of educated Americans only see the tribes as civilized from the perspective of the Rousseauian belief in the noble savage. So they weren't civilized, they were savages, and we should have left them as so, because they were pure, innocent, sweet, non-violent until they interacted with white people. Now that is absolutely 100% historical bullshit. The book last week, Summer of the Empire Moon, definitively proves that that was bullshit. They were not innocent, sweet, peaceable, loving, peace-loving savages. They were human, just like everybody else. We're going to circle back to that. But were they civilized? Okay, were they savages? Were they civilized? Well, was civilized from the dictionary.com definition has like 4 meanings, right? Having an advanced or humane culture or society, polite, well-bred, refined, of or relating to civilized people. And number 4 is particularly interesting, easy to manage or control. Well, from that perspective, from 19th century perspective, they were definitely not 1, 2, or 3, right? But 4, well, my God, they managed to civilize them, didn't they? Oh, God damn, that is good. Oh, my God, that is good. Hell, even today, when Hollywood depicts, for example, Cheyenne culture, like if you look at that episode in Longmire, it's like the first or second season. It's fairly early on, where the dog soldiers in Longmire are piercing their breasts to hang in the sun and to inspire visions, right? This is to show that their noble savagery, not their civility. But this is because the God they are sacrificing themselves to is not the Christian God, like say the Flagellants in the 14th century, who beat themselves, literally, cat o' nine tails, beat themselves until their backs ran red with blood. There's depictions of this in Hollywood too, and people look and go, oh my God, that's awful. Why would this civilized man do that? Because it's self-sacrifice. It's self-mortification to feel closer to God. But Americans did not grant that same grace to the Cheyenne, whose gods were different from America's own, right? The argument can absolutely be made that when one reaches the point of self-mortification as part of religious ceremonies, peak civilization has been obtained. But that was definitely not seen by the farmers, who thought farming was peak civilization, not the hunter-gatherer clans of the High Plains. Noble savage, I mentioned that last week, and then just a minute ago, what is that? And I think Britannica, I think is where I got most of my definition on this one, actually traces the concept of the noble savage all the way back to the Greeks and ancient Romans. But it hit high peak philosophy and became better known in the West in the 18th and early 19th centuries, starting with the political philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau and several other authors, including Francois-René de Chateaubriand, James Fenimore Cooper, the guy who wrote The Last of the Mohicans, very, very famous movie with, was it Daniel Day-Lewis in it? Hollywood's hearts were fluttering, and women everywhere wanted that noble savage that was depicted there, right? Herman Melville, Pequod in there, not the Pequod was the boat. At least one of the sailors on there was a noble savage, for Moby Dick. They all created this romanticized ideal of the uncivilized man who symbolizes the innate goodness of one not exposed to the corrupting influences of civilization. Like basically, if we had never gone west, the tribes would have lived in peace forever, which is provably false. Again, reference last week's book. Last week's book, the author talks specifically about the Congress critters back in D.C. who are very wedded to this concept of the noble savage, and that belief hit a brick wall when it ran into the Comanche Empire. Part of what fueled that belief in Washington was, well, first off, the 5 civilized tribes, the Iroquois, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminole, and what was the 5th one? Shit, who was the 5th one? Thank God for Google. Muskogee. Oh, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole. Excuse me, not even the Iroquois. They were the 5 civilized tribes. Meaning they were already planting things. They already had a farmer culture, and they got along fairly well with Americans. Fairly well. They did put up some resistance, which is what led to the Trail of Tears, right? There's a long history of tragedy here. I'm getting off topic. Let's pull this back. So people back in D.C. believe, or people who buy the noble savage romanticization, believe that the tribes would have lived in peace with the white Americans who are clamming for gold in them thar hills if we had just let them. But that's, again, provably not true. All right, not just the attacks on wagon trains. I'm talking about it's provably not true, because the tribes would have continued to make war against each other for such incursions. A little more on that in a bit, right? But if they would attack other tribes, they sure as hell are not going to stop attacking settlers moving across their territory. That's just common sense. Common sense ain't that common these days. But America figured, once we'd corrupted them with contact, then we should really go all the way and bring them into God's fold. Hence the Indian Wars. So the first chapter of this book provides an incredibly brief, and I mean brief, it's like 5 pages to go over the conquest of the 5 civilized tribes of the East Coast in general before going into the conquest of the Western tribes, which encompasses the entire rest of the book, which is fair, because those Eastern tribes were conquered from Jamestown, so the mid-16th century, up until, well, the American Revolution. And then from there, so we don't have a lot of stories from the survivors then, but we do have a lot of stories from the survivors of the American Indian Wars in the West, right? Because they went to reservations, people would go talk to them, we'd get their stories. So we do have that information. Fair, because Americans were not as bad as Genghis Khan. We left survivors. Really throws a dent in the whole Americans were always the good guys narrative when you hear their stories. The entire rest of the book encompasses these narratives of the survivors from the various tribes. And we've got stories from the Sioux, the Crow, the Cheyenne, some from the Comanche even, the Navajo, the Apache, the Ute, the Nez Perce. Everybody west of Mississippi, there's a voice represented here, right? And it's quite clever how it's laid out, because he actually goes through a logical timeline starting in 1850 up to 1890. So he covers a 40-year span of American history here from the perspective of the Native Americans. And each chapter starts with a very brief timeline of the world events that were going on at that time, not just what we're going to review in that chapter. In fact, I don't think he mentions what we're going to review in the chapter, but he says this is what was happening in the world in 1862. Not just the American Civil War, but you had this happening in England and this happening in India, actual India, not Indian tribes, but India over way in the Far East. And this is what was happening in China and Russia. So, and it's good because it gives you a sense of how none of this happened in a vacuum. People tend to think that history happens in a vacuum, that only one historical event is occurring at any given time. Not true. So none of this happens in a vacuum, right? I mean, historical events happen in more than one place at a time. I mean, here in the United States, this same week, we had the murder of Irenia Zarutska and then the murder of Charlie Kirk. On the other side of the planet, Nepal rebelled and overthrew China. 3 historical events happening within the span of a week of each other on opposite sides of the globe. We just know about them a hell of a lot faster thanks to social media and, hey baby, who's the kid who was in Nepal recording it all as it went down? I don't think anybody knows just how often I go off script when I'm doing my recording. but it's just one thought leads to another, and so I have to include it. Don't drink the rest, but this is a broken oath. It's pretty damn good, actually. Don't like it?
We hate the cold.
Okay, and this is on YouTube?
Yes.
Okay. So on YouTube, his name is We Hate the Cold, and he was biking through Nepal when shit went down, and he fucking live streamed it all for everybody. So we have 2 completely unrelated historical events happening on opposite sides of the fucking globe at the same time. Go on. And so that is what I'm talking about here. Nothing happens in a vacuum. It's just, it was a lot harder. It's a lot harder now to bury the things you don't want the rest of the world to know about. Like, you think China wants the world to know Nepal rebelled? Fuck no. And so here we are. So when he moves to the West, he actually starts in 1860 with the Long Walk of the Navajos. That's the name of the chapter, who were historically located in just about where the 4 corners are located. So Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, where they meet. That's where that was their traditional area. And they ended up in just about the same place, which is unusual. Most of the reservations were hell and gone from the historical stomping grounds of the Indians, of the tribes that ended up there. I mean, hell, they after making all of the, Cherokee and Seminole leave Florida and go to Oklahoma, they ended up shipping quite a few of the rebelling chiefs back to Florida to keep them, far away from their people. I mean, it's fucking bureaucracy. That's how fucked it was. But the Navajo took basically 8 years of being shuffled back and forth to end up where they ended up, which is almost the same spot. Now, I know in last week's review I said something about how the Comanche would assume perfidy on the part of all whites if one white person violated a treaty, something like that. I'm paraphrasing myself badly, but I said something like that. And I knew at the time that that was a knife that cut both ways, and D. Brown's book proves that, because the Navajo had historically actually gotten along quite well with the Americans. Right? They were friendly with Kit Carson when Kit Carson came through. Right? They viewed him as a friend up until 1860, when he decided that his political career was more important than getting along with the tribes who had befriended him. A few Navajo, for lack of a better metaphor, went off the reservation. They weren't actually on the reservation, but they went off the beaten track. They broke with their tribe and attacked some Americans. And the Americans at the time assumed that all Navajo were doing the same instead of these few bad actors. This, incidentally, I am noticing, is a theme that spans history, because very recently, we all just assume that if one person does something bad, everybody who agrees with that person is also bad. If one person says something we don't like, everybody else must be the same. We're all human, folks. Nobody gets off this planet alive. We should really try and get along together. There's story after story to this effect in the book. I mean, almost all of them started with the treaty being set in place, and then America violates that treaty in some way. And a lot of it was the American violations, all right? I have 100% no doubt that there were definitely times when the native tribes violated it first. That is not the story of this book. All right, find those stories, put them in a book for me, I'll read it. This is a story told from the perspective of the tribes, and the tribes report that the Americans all violated the treaty first. They found a cat to chase. And it's heartbreaking to read about, because when the tribes fight back, chaos and death is rained down upon them for having the gall to have their own opinions, for having the temerity to speak out against what they knew was wrong. Chaos and death was rained down upon them. There is also a lesson there. There's a whole lot of history repeating itself this week. I mean, it's not all doom and gloom. It truly isn't. All right, and this is important. And I admire that Brown didn't do that. That he didn't just, say that it all sucked and all white people sucked. It wasn't that. In fact, he does a masterful job of weaving in the tales of non-perfidious white people, people who the tribes trusted because individuals earned that trust and never broke it once given. And he includes, it probably wasn't predictable at the time, but 100 years later, having read the history I've read, it is not at all surprising to me that when soldiers who tried to do right by the tribes were punished professionally for not siding with their fellow white man. I am not in the least bit surprised by this from the safe remove of 150 years later. At the time, it was pretty shocking and horrifying to the poor guys who were trying to do the right thing, and got fucked for it by their military superiors. It's not a pretty story. This is not pretty history. History rarely is pretty, all right? Everybody likes to read, I shouldn't say everybody. Statistically, women enjoy reading historical romances, all right, and paranormal romances. They like the idea of taming the bad boy, right? That is the overarching theme of virtually every romance novel out there, is the bad guy that gets tamed by one woman. That's why women love Beth and Rip on Yellowstone, is the bad boy who gets tamed by one wild woman, and the two of them form a wild love couple, right? Very popular romantic trope, because women like to read history. I'm not going to lie, reading historical romance is what sparked my own interest in history, is how much of what I was reading could or did happen. History is not pretty. History of conquest and warfare is horrifying. All right, and that's what this was. This was the history of conquest and warfare. He absolutely includes the history where members of one tribe would act as scouts for the U.S. Army. I want to say it was the Pawnee acting against the Cheyenne. I may be mistaking the tribes here, but this was mentioned in here. I know in last week's book it was the Apache acting as scout, last month. The book on the Rangers that I read, the Apache were acting as scouts against the Comanche. They may have been in here in last week's book too, but I know for sure it was in the book on the Rangers that I read last month. So he includes that these tribes would act as scouts for the U.S. Army, basically betraying their fellow Indian. But that's not how they saw it back then. They saw it as, I'm Pawnee, they're Cheyenne, they're the enemy. Because, hey, we're all human, which means we all have this human sense of who we belong to, who our tribe is, right? And Cheyenne was not the Pawnee tribe, so they would scout for the army, only to have the army then turn on their scouts once they were no longer needed and force them into reservations also. Because as much as historical revisionists like to pretend that all the tribes were one big kumbaya happy family, they were not. Each tribe was unique unto itself. Each band within a tribe was unique unto itself, and saw other tribes as anywhere from friendly to neutral to sworn enemies. Very much like the history of Europe and China and Africa, Central Europe, moving into Western Asia, everywhere else. It turns out that the Native Americans, just as human as the rest of us, just as prone to the human foibles as the rest of us. But just as important as what is said is what is not said in the book. And it includes multiple stories of tribal leaders who would be invited to Washington, D.C. to meet with the congressional leaders and whoever the sitting president happened to be. And to a man, each leader would come back to the tribes and preach peace and advise their people to go to the reservations. Now, why would that be? Well, the implication in the book is that these leaders are turned on their own, right? In fact, invariably, these leaders were seen as traitors to their own kind. One chief, I think it was from the Nez Perce, although I might be misremembering the tribe, refused to go to D.C., remarking exactly that when his brother had gone, he'd returned fat and in the white man's camp, basically. He returned and was like, nope, we're gonna do what the white people say. So here's the thing. And I'm not sure how many people actually catch this on reading. The introductory notes of what's going on in the world at the beginning of each chapter includes census update information at the 10-year marks. So in 1860, the U.S. population was 31,443,321. By 1870, the population was 38,558,371. By 1880, we're at 50,155,783. 1890, when the Battle of Wounded Knee occurred, the U.S. population was 62,622,250. So in a 30-year span, 1860 to 1890, the U.S. population had effectively doubled. And the vast majority of that population was east of the Mississippi. So what's going on? Well, Congress and the president invites the tribal leaders to D.C. to meet with them. It's mark of great honor and respect, right? We're inviting you to come to our home, see where we live, we'll talk it out, see if we can come to an agreement together. And silently behind it, all right, and the tribes, of course, would be very honored by this because, hey, get a free trip on the government's dime, we're going to go talk to the president. It's an object lesson. Because as they're traveling east to D.C., they are stopping in all the major metro areas. You're stopping in Chicago, you're stopping in Philadelphia, you're looping down through Boston and down into D.C., and you're seeing these massive population centers. And so what the chiefs are seeing as they're driving through these areas, riding through these areas on the Iron Horse, look what numbers we can bring to bear on a war if you insist on having it. We will wipe you out with what we can bring to this war. And that message was undoubtedly received by the chiefs. They weren't stupid. They were not savages. They were quite civilized, and they were quite capable of doing the math and going, holy fuck, my tiny tribe of 3,000, with only maybe a third being warriors, cannot possibly take on these numbers. Now, that's not to say they didn't fight. They absolutely did. And there are stories in here. There's even triumphal stories of the Indians, like he briefly covers Wounded Knee. I'm sorry, not Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee is where they all died. Little Bighorn, where, Custer bit the bullet because he was an incompetent jackass. I should really read a book on Custer before saying that, but everything I've said says he was a showboat. I really should read a book on Custer. I don't want to read a book on that guy. So the chiefs would see this. They would understand this unspoken message, and that capitulation was the only means by which they might be able to save their people and provide them any kind of a future. It's not going to be the ideal where they were living free and happy and able to roam the land and hunt at will and live their lives. But if their people wanted to live, they had to do this. They had to go to the reservations, because if not, there were millions waiting to flood west and take from them by force what they would not give by treaty. It's horrifying. Of course it's horrifying. Why do you think that people are freaking out so much about immigrant invasions from South America? Right? They're seeing this happening in real time and going, wait a minute, we know the end of this story. We forced this story on the tribes that were here before. Of course we're going to freak out about people just invading our land. What an effective propaganda campaign against the chiefs, right? To just peacefully drive them east and let them see the swarm of locusts that were waiting to flood their territory. Effective, man. This book was sad to read. It was sad to read the stories from the perspective of those who survived the tragedies. I didn't think I was going to cry during this one, but I'm going to take a minute here. The last page of the book, before getting into the indices and we're excited, was a picture of Chief Red Cloud. It was an absolutely heartrending quote from him. Quote, "They made us many promises, more than I can remember, but they never kept but one. They promised to take our land, and they took it." Historically, Americans like to see themselves as the good guy. And hell, all peoples do, right? All people, everywhere, even those who commit the most heinous of acts, see themselves as this good guy. And that silent object lesson absorbed by the chiefs on their cross-country journey to Washington, D.C. to meet with the great father in the heart of American power accomplished more than getting the major leaders to quietly concede. Ultimately allowed for a damn near bloodless war of attrition to be fought. Not entirely bloodless. I mean, the tribes did not go quietly into that good night. Did not go gently into that good night is the quote, excuse me. They did not go gentle into that good night. They raged like hell against the dying light. But had they continued to rage, we would not now have any tribes left to remind us all of our blood-soaked past. If they had continued to fight, there would be no survivors to remind us of the cost of victory and our own humanity. This is a cocktail that OpenAI kicked back to me. This isn't even from a website. So they were just like, here, try this. I have no doubt that AI is reading my algorithms and going, yeah, I'll bet she'll like this one. There's not enough alcohol in the world right now to help me with the feels I'm having. I'm not making excuses for the American pioneers, right? You can't change history. You can't go back in time and say, hey, maybe just let the tribes continue to hunt as long as they promise not to rip the farmers' crops, right? Hey, why don't we lease the land from you to get this gold, and we'll pay you a percentage of the gold we dig out. Can't do that. You can't change the past, right? Why don't we just grant the tribe citizenship and protection under the American law, which, I mean, ultimately happened in 1924. They were not granted citizenship and thus the right to vote until 1924, after Americans had taken what they wanted. It is what it is. Can't change the past. Because ultimately, the history of the American West is a battle for resources. The tribes had it. They had the land. Amazing farmland. They had the gold. They had the land and the gold of the Black Hills and the Sierra Nevadas and the Comstock Mountain Range. I don't even know what it's called. It's not the Sierra, or is it part of the Sierra Nevadas? I don't know. Nevada is the most mountainous state in the nation. Most people aren't aware of that. It's the Great Basin, right? The Great Basin is where the ghost dance started. Vodka, which I knew. I was born in Colorado, but I basically grew up in Nevada, so this is part of my history, is knowing that. And the ghost dance started in Nevada. And good God, it was basically an offshoot of Christianity, if you believe it. It was, don't hurt people, but it was the dancing, the drums. It freaked out the fucking Christians, man. They could not handle somebody worshiping not the way they worshipped. That's what led to Wounded Knee. God, it's like the fight happened by accident. It's kind of like how the Berlin Wall fell by accident. So the American West is a story of the battle of resources. The tribes had it, and Americans wanted it. And with millions, tens of millions amassing east of the Mississippi, the only way to ensure the survival of any of the native tribes was to guarantee them smaller segments of land on reservations. And then because, people suck, and because the government is so fucking efficient at running things, they they assign corrupt politicians to run those reservations. The exception, believe it or not, is John Clume in Arizona with the Apache reservation, who basically said, form your own police force. Police yourselves. And the Apaches didn't trust him. Hey, I get it, man. It's not like the white people had provided a whole lot of reason why they should be trusted. Believe it or not, a whole lot of that is covered in the Tom Clavin book that I read last month, Tombstone. Goes a whole lot into John Clume. But because our Congress critters have always been utterly faithless, and this is an important lesson for Americans to remember right now. Look at the fight Thomas Massey's having just to get 219 signatures to release Epstein's list. Our Congress critters are utterly faithless. We are nothing to them. They are absolute shit at ensuring equal protection under the law. So they broke promises, broke oaths. The history of conquest is never pretty. But sometimes someone survives to tell the other side of the story. That's it for this week, guys. If you liked what you saw, if you like seeing me cry on camera, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you guys next week.